Chapter 9. Blood-stained altars. The entrance through which he caught his first glimpse of the interior was rather beautifully carved in geometric designs, and within the walls were similarly treated, though as he proceeded from one apartment to another he found also the figures of animals, birds, and men taking their places among the more formal figures of the mural decorator's art. Stone vessels were much in evidence, as well as ornaments of gold and the skins of many animals, but nowhere did he see an indication of any woven fabric, indicating that, in that respect at least, the Hodan were still low in the scale of evolution. And yet the proportions and symmetry of the corridors and apartments bespoke a degree of civilization. The way led through several apartments and long corridors, up at least 3 flights of stone stairs, and finally out upon a ledge upon the western side of the building overlooking the blue lake. Along this ledge, or arcade, his guide led him for 100 yards, to stop at last before a wide entranceway leading into another apartment of the palace. Here Tarzan beheld a considerable concourse of warriors in an enormous apartment, the domed ceiling of which was fully 50 feet above the floor. Almost filling the chamber was a great pyramid ascending in broad steps well up under the dome, in which were a number of round apertures which let in the light. The steps of the pyramid were occupied by warriors to the very pinnacle, upon which sat a large, imposing figure of a man whose golden trappings shone brightly in the light of the afternoon sun, a shaft of which poured through one of the tiny apertures of the dome. "Khotan," cried Daklot, addressing the resplendent figure at the pinnacle of the pyramid. "Khotan and warriors of Palul Don, behold the honor that Jad Ben Otho has done you in sending as his messenger his own son." And Daklot, stepping aside, indicated Tarzan with a dramatic sweep of his hand. Khotan rose to his feet, and every warrior within sight craned his neck to have a better view of the newcomer. Those upon the opposite side of the pyramid crowded to the front, as the words of the old warrior reached them. Skeptical were the expressions on most of the faces, but theirs was a skepticism marked with caution. No matter which way fortune jumped, they wished to be upon the right side of the fence. For a moment all eyes were centered upon Tarzan, and then gradually they drifted to Khotan, for from his attitude would they receive the cue that would determine theirs. But Khotan was evidently in the same quandary as they. The very attitude of his body indicated it. It was one of indecision and of doubt. The ape-man stood erect, his arms folded upon his broad breast, an expression of haughty disdain upon his handsome face, but to Daklot there seemed to be indications also of growing anger. The situation was becoming strained. Daklot fidgeted, casting apprehensive glances at Tarzan and appealing ones at Khotan. The silence of the tomb wrapped the great chamber of the throne room of Palul Don. At last Khotan spoke. "Who says that he is Doro Olotho?" he asked, casting a terrible look at Daklot. "He does," almost shouted that terrified noble. "And so it must be true?" queried Khotan. Could it be that there was a trace of irony in the chief's tone? "Otho forbid." Daklot cast a side glance at Tarzan, a glance that he intended should carry the assurance of his own faith, but that succeeded only in impressing the ape-man with the other's pitiable terror. "O Khotan," pleaded Daklot, "your own eyes must convince you that indeed he is the son of Otho. Behold his godlike figure, his hands and his feet, that are not as ours, and that he is entirely tailless as is his mighty father." Khotan appeared to be perceiving these facts for the first time, and there was an indication that his skepticism was faltering. At that moment a young warrior who had pushed his way forward from the opposite side of the pyramid to where he could obtain a good look at Tarzan raised his voice. "Khotan," he cried, "it must be even as Daklot says, for I am sure now that I have seen Doro Otho before. Yesterday as we were returning with the Quarolul prisoners we beheld him seated upon the back of a great griff. We hid in the woods before he came too near. But I saw enough to make sure that he who rode upon the great beast was none other than the messenger who stands here now." This evidence seemed to be quite enough to convince the majority of the warriors that they indeed stood in the presence of deity. Their faces showed it only too plainly, and a sudden modesty that caused them to shrink behind their neighbors. As their neighbors were attempting to do the same thing, the result was a sudden melting away of those who stood nearest the ape-man, until the steps of the pyramid directly before him lay vacant to the very apex and to Khotan. The latter, possibly influenced as much by the fearful attitude of his followers as by the evidence adduced, now altered his tone and his manner in such a degree as might comport with the requirements if the stranger was indeed the Doro Otho, while leaving his dignity a loophole of escape should it appear that he had entertained an impostor. "If indeed you are the Doro Olotho," he said, Addressing Tarzan, "You will know that our doubts were but natural, since we have received no sign from Jad Ben Otho that he intended honoring us so greatly, nor how could we know, even, that the great god had a son. If you are he, all Palil Don rejoices to honor you. If you are not he, swift and terrible shall be the punishment of your temerity. I, Tan, king of Palil Don, have spoken. And spoken well, as a king should speak," said Tarzan, breaking his long silence. "Who fears and honors the god of his people. It is well that you insist that I indeed be the Doro Olotho before you accord me the homage that is my due. Jad Ben Otho charged me specially to ascertain if you are fit to rule his people. My first experience of you indicates that Jad Ben Otho chose well when he breathed the spirit of a king into the babe at your mother's breast." The effect of this statement, made so casually, was marked in the expressions and excited whispers of the now awe-struck assemblage. At last they knew how kings were made. It was decided by Jad Ben Otho while the candidate was still a suckling babe. Wonderful. A miracle. And this divine creature in whose presence they stood knew all about it. Doubtless he even discussed such matters with their god daily. If there had been an atheist among them before, or an agnostic, there was none now, for had they not looked with their own eyes upon the Son of God? "It is well then," continued the ape-man, "that you should assure yourself that I am no impostor. Come closer that you may see that I am not as our men. Furthermore, it is not meet that you stand upon a higher level than the Son of your God." There was a sudden scramble to reach the floor of the throne room, nor was Tan far behind his warriors, though he managed to maintain a certain majestic dignity as he descended the broad stairs that countless naked feet had polished to a gleaming smoothness through the ages. "And now," said Tarzan as the king stood before him, "you can have no doubt that I am not of the same race as you. Your priests have told you that Jad Ben Otho is tailless. Tailless, therefore, must be the race of gods that spring from his loins. But enough of such proofs as these. You know the power of Jad Ben Otho, how his lightnings gleaming out of the sky carry death as he wills it, how the rains come at his bidding, and the fruits and the berries and the grains, the grasses, the trees and the flowers spring to life at his divine direction. You have witnessed birth and death, and those who honor their God honor him because he controls these things. How would it fare then with an impostor who claimed to be the son of this all-powerful God? This then is all the proof that you require, for as he would strike you down should you deny me, so would he strike down one who wrongfully claimed kinship with him. This line of argument being unanswerable must needs be convincing. There could be no questioning of this creature's statements without the tacit admission of lack of faith in the omnipotence of Jad Ben Otho. Tan was satisfied that he was entertaining deity, but as to just what form his entertainment should take he was rather at a loss to know. His conception of God had been rather a vague and hazy affair, though in common with all primitive people his God was a personal one, as were his devils and demons. The pleasures of Jad Ben Otho he had assumed to be the excesses which he himself enjoyed, but devoid of any unpleasant reaction. It therefore occurred to him that the Doro Loto would be greatly entertained by eating large quantities of everything that Tan liked best, and that he had found most injurious. And there was also a drink that the women of the Hodon made by allowing corn to soak in the juices of succulent fruits, to which they had added certain other ingredients best known to themselves. Tan knew by experience that a single draught of this potent liquor would bring happiness and surcease from worry, while several would cause even a king to do things and enjoy things that he would never even think of doing or enjoying while not under the magical influence of the potion. But unfortunately the next morning brought suffering in direct ratio to the joy of the preceding day. A god, Tan reasoned, could experience all the pleasure without the headache, but for the immediate present he must think of the necessary dignities and honors to be accorded his immortal guest. No foot other than a king's had touched the surface of the apex of the pyramid in the throne room at Allur during all the forgotten ages through which the kings of Pal Duldan had ruled from its high eminence. So what higher honor could Tan offer than to give place beside him to the Doro Oldo? And so he invited Tarzan to ascend the pyramid and take his place upon the stone bench that topped it. As they reached the step below the sacred pinnacle, Tan continued as though to mount to his throne, but Tarzan laid a detaining hand upon his arm. None may sit upon a level with the gods, he admonished, stepping confidently up and seating himself upon the throne. The abashed Tan showed his embarrassment, an embarrassment he feared to voice lest he incur the wrath of the King of Kings. But added Tarzan, a god may honor his faithful servant by inviting him to a place at his side. Come, Ko-Tan, thus would I honor you in the name of Jad Ben Otho. The ape-man's policy had for its basis an attempt not only to arouse the fearful respect of Ko-Tan, but to do it without making of him an enemy at heart, for he did not know how strong a hold the religion of the Hodon had upon them. For, since the time that he had prevented Ta-Den and Omat from quarreling over a religious difference, the subject had been utterly taboo among them. He was therefore quick to note the evident though wordless resentment of Ko-Tan at the suggestion that he entirely relinquish his throne to his guest. On the whole, however, the effect had been satisfactory, as he could see from the renewed evidence of awe upon the faces of the warriors. At Tarzan's direction, the business of the court continued where it had been interrupted by his advent. It consisted principally in the settling of disputes between warriors. There was present one who stood upon the step just below the throne, and which Tarzan was to learn was the place reserved for the higher chiefs of the allied tribes which made up Ko-Tan's kingdom. The one who attracted Tarzan's attention was a stalwart warrior of powerful physique and massive lion-like features. He was addressing Ko-Tan on a question that is as old as government, and that will continue in unabated importance until man ceases to exist. It had to do with a boundary dispute with one of his neighbors. The matter itself held little or no interest for Tarzan, but he was impressed by the appearance of the speaker, and when Ko-Tan addressed him as Ja-Don, the ape-man's interest was permanently crystallized, for Ja-Don was the father of Ta-Den. That the knowledge would benefit him in any way seemed rather a remote possibility, since he could not reveal to Ja-Don his friendly relations with his son without admitting the falsity of his claims to godship. When the affairs of the audience were concluded, Ko-Tan suggested that the son of Jad Ben Otho might wish to visit the temple in which were performed the religious rites coincident to the worship of the great god. And so the ape-man was conducted by the king himself, followed by the warriors of his court, through the corridors of the palace toward the northern end of the group of buildings within the royal enclosure. The temple itself was really a part of the palace and similar in architecture. There were several ceremonial places of varying sizes, the purposes of which Tarzan could only conjecture. Each had an altar in the west end and another in the east, and were oval in shape, their longest diameter lying due east and west. Each was excavated from the summit of a small hillock, and all were without roofs. The western altars invariably were a single block of stone, the top of which was hollowed into an oblong basin. Those at the eastern ends were similar blocks of stone with flat tops, and these latter, unlike those at the opposite ends of the ovals, were invariably stained or painted a reddish brown. Nor did Tarzan need to examine them closely to be assured of what his keen nostrils already had told him, that the brown stains were dried and drying human blood. Below these temple courts were corridors and apartments reaching far into the bowels of the hills, dim, gloomy passages that Tarzan glimpsed as he was led from place to place on his tour of inspection of the temple. A messenger had been dispatched by Ko-Tan to announce the coming visit of the son of Jad Ben Otho, with the result that they were accompanied through the temple by a considerable procession of priests, whose distinguishing mark of profession seemed to consist in grotesque headdresses. Sometimes hideous faces carved from wood and entirely concealing the countenances of their wearers, or again the head of a wild beast cunningly fitted over the head of a man. The high priest alone wore no such headdress. He was an old man with close-set, cunning eyes and a cruel, thin-lipped mouth. At first sight of him, Tarzan realized that here lay the greatest danger to his ruse, for he saw at a glance that the man was antagonistic toward him and his pretensions. And he knew too that doubtless of all the people of Pal-Ul-Don, the high priest was most likely to harbor the truest estimate of Jad Ben Otho, and therefore would look with suspicion on one who claimed to be the son of a fabulous god. No matter what suspicion lurked within his crafty mind, Lu-Don, the high priest of Allur, did not openly question Tarzan's right to the title of Doril-Otho. And it may be that he was restrained by the same doubts which had originally restrained Ko-Tan and his warriors, the doubt that is at the bottom of the minds of all blasphemers even, and which is based upon the fear that after all there may be a god. So for the time being at least Lu-Don played safe, yet Tarzan knew as well as though the man had spoken aloud his inmost thoughts that it was in the heart of the high priest to tear the veil from his imposture. At the entrance to the temple, Ko-Tan had relinquished the guidance of the guest to Lu-Don, and now the latter led Tarzan through those portions of the temple that he wished him to see. He showed him the great room where the votive offerings were kept, gifts from the barbaric chiefs of Pal-Ul-Don and from their followers. These things ranged in value from presents of dried fruits to massive vessels of beaten gold, so that in the great main storeroom and its connecting chambers and corridors was an accumulation of wealth that amazed even the eyes of the owner of the secret of the treasure vaults of Opar. Moving to and fro throughout the temple were sleek black Wasdon slaves, fruits of the Hodon raids upon the villages of their less civilized neighbors. As they passed the barred entrance to a dim corridor, Tarzan saw within a great company of pithecanthropi of all ages and of both sexes, Hodon as well as Wasdon, the majority of them squatted upon the stone floor in attitudes of utter dejection while some paced back and forth, their features stamped with the despair of utter hopelessness. "And who are these who lie here thus unhappily?" he asked of Ludon. It was the first question that he had put to the high priest since entering the temple, and instantly he regretted that he had asked it, for Ludon turned upon him a face upon which the expression of suspicion was but thinly veiled. "Who should know better than the son of Jad Ben Otho?" he retorted. "The questions of Doru Ulotho are not with impunity answered with other questions," said the ape-man quietly, "and it may interest Ludon, the high priest, to know that the blood of a false priest upon the altar of his temple is not displeasing in the eyes of Jad Ben Otho." Ludon paled as he answered Tarzan's question. "They are the offerings whose blood must refresh the eastern altars as the sun returns to your father at the day's end." "And who told you," asked Tarzan, "that Jad Ben Otho was pleased that his people were slain upon his altars? What if you were mistaken?" "Then countless thousands have died in vain," replied Ludon. Tan and the surrounding warriors and priests were listening attentively to the dialogue. Some of the poor victims behind the barred gateway had heard and, rising, pressed close to the barrier through which one was conducted just before sunset each day, never to return. "Liberate them," cried Tarzan with a wave of his hand toward the imprisoned victims of a cruel superstition, "for I can tell you in the name of Jad Ben Otho that you are mistaken." Chapter 10. The Forbidden Garden. Ludon paled. "It is sacrilege," he cried. "For countless ages have the priests of the great god offered each night a life to the spirit of Jad Ben Otho as it returned below the western horizon to its master, and never has the great god given sign that he was displeased." "Stop," commanded Tarzan. "It is the blindness of the priesthood that has failed to read the messages of their god. Your warriors die beneath the knives and clubs of the Wasdon. Your hunters are taken by Ja and Jato. No day goes by but witnesses the deaths of few or many in the villages of the Hodon. And one death each day of those that die are the toll which Jad Ben Otho has exacted for the lives you take upon the eastern altar. What greater sign of his displeasure could you require, O stupid priest?" Ludon was silent. There was raging within him a great conflict between his fear that this indeed might be the Son of God and his hope that it was not, but at last his fear won, and he bowed his head. "The son of Jad Ben Otho has spoken," he said, and turning to one of the lesser priests, "Remove the bars and return these people from whence they came." He thus addressed did as he was bid, and as the bars came down, the prisoners, now all fully aware of the miracle that had saved them, crowded forward and throwing themselves upon their knees before Tarzan raised their voices in thanksgiving. Tan was almost as staggered as the high priest by this ruthless overturning of an age-old religious rite. But what he cried, "May we do that," will be pleasing in the eyes of Jad Ben Otho, turning a look of puzzled apprehension toward the ape-man. "If you seek to please your God," he replied, "place upon your altars such gifts of food and apparel as are most welcome in the city of your people. These things will Jad Ben Otho bless, when you may distribute them among those of the city who need them most. With such things are your storerooms filled as I have seen with mine own eyes, and other gifts will be brought when the priests tell the people that in this way they find favor before their God." And Tarzan turned and signified that he would leave the temple. As they were leaving the precincts devoted to the worship of their deity, the ape-man noticed a small but rather ornate building that stood entirely detached from the others, as though it had been cut from a little pinnacle of limestone which had stood out from its fellows. As his interested glance passed over it, he noticed that its door and windows were barred. "To what purpose is that building dedicated?" he asked of Ludon. "Who do you keep imprisoned there?" "It is nothing," replied the high priest nervously. "There is no one there. The place is vacant. Once it was used, but not now for many years," and he moved on toward the gateway which led back into the palace. Here he and the priests halted while Tarzan with Tan and his warriors passed out from the sacred precincts of the temple grounds. The one question which Tarzan would have asked he had feared to ask, for he knew that in the hearts of many lay a suspicion as to his genuineness, but he determined that before he slept he would put the question to Tan, either directly or indirectly as to whether there was, or had been recently, within the city of Allure a female of the same race as his. As their evening meal was being served to them in the banquet hall of Cayotan's palace by a part of the army of black slaves upon whose shoulders fell the burden of all the heavy and menial tasks of the city, Tarzan noticed that there came to the eyes of one of the slaves what was apparently an expression of startled recognition as he looked upon the ape-man for the first time in the banquet hall of Cayotan. And again later he saw the fellow whisper to another slave and nod his head in his direction. The ape-man did not recall ever having seen this Wasdon before, and he was at a loss to account for an explanation of the fellow's interest in him, and presently the incident was all but forgotten. Cayotan was surprised and inwardly disgusted to discover that his godly guest had no desire to gorge himself upon rich foods and that he would not even so much as taste the villainous brew of the Hodon. To Tarzan the banquet was a dismal and tiresome affair, since so great was the interest of the guests in gorging themselves with food and drink that they had no time for conversation, the only vocal sounds being confined to a continuous grunting which, together with their table manners, reminded Tarzan of a visit he had once made to the famous Berkshire herd of his Grace, the Duke of Westminster at Woodhouse, Chester. One by one the diners succumbed to the stupefying effects of the liquor, with the result that the grunting gave place to snores, so presently Tarzan and the slaves were the only conscious creatures in the banquet hall. Rising, the ape-man turned to a tall black who stood behind him. "I would sleep," he said. "Show me to my apartment." As the fellow conducted him from the chamber, the slave, who had shown surprise earlier in the evening at sight of him, spoke again at length to one of his fellows. The latter cast a half-frightened look in the direction of the departing ape-man. "If you are right," he said, "they should reward us with our liberty, but if you are wrong, O Jad Ben Otho, what will be our fate?" "But I am not wrong," cried the other. "Then there is but one to tell this too, for I have heard that he looked sour when this Doro Otho was brought to the temple, and that, while the so-called son of Jad Ben Otho was there, he gave this one every cause to fear and hate him. I mean Loudon, the high priest." "You know him?" asked the other slave. "I have worked in the temple," replied his companion. "Then go to him at once and tell him, but be sure to exact the promise of our freedom for the proof." And so a black Wasdon came to the temple gate and asked to see Loudon, the high priest, on a matter of great importance, and though the hour was late, Loudon saw him. And when he had heard his story, he promised him and his friend not only their freedom but many gifts if they could prove the correctness of their claims. And as the slave talked with the high priest in the temple at Allure, the figure of a man groped its way around the shoulder of Pastor Ulved, and the moonlight glistened from the shiny barrel of an Enfield that was strapped to the naked back. And brass cartridges shed tiny rays of reflected light from their polished cases, where they hung in the bandoliers across the broad brown shoulders and the lean waist. Tarzan's guide conducted him to a chamber overlooking the blue lake, where he found a bed similar to that which he had seen in the villages of the Wasdon, merely a raised dais of stone upon which was piled great quantities of furry pelts. And so he lay down to sleep, the question that he most wished to put still unasked and unanswered. With the coming of a new day he was awake and wandering about the palace and the palace grounds before there was sign of any of the inmates of the palace other than slaves, or at least he saw no others at first. Though presently he stumbled upon an enclosure which lay almost within the center of the palace grounds, surrounded by a wall that piqued the ape-man's curiosity, since he had determined to investigate as fully as possible every part of the palace and its environs. And this place, whatever it might be, was apparently without doors or windows, but that it was at least partially roofless was evidenced by the sight of the waving branches of a tree which spread above the top of the wall near him. Finding no other method of access, the ape-man uncoiled his rope, and throwing it over the branch of the tree where it projected beyond the wall, was soon climbing with the ease of a monkey to the summit. There he found that the wall surrounded an enclosed garden in which grew trees and shrubs and flowers in riotous profusion. Without waiting to ascertain whether the garden was empty or contained Hodon, Wasdon, or wild beasts, Tarzan dropped lightly to the sward on the inside and without further loss of time commenced a systematic investigation of the enclosure. His curiosity was aroused by the very evident fact that the place was not for general use, even by those who had free access to other parts of the palace grounds, and so there was added to its natural beauties an absence of mortals which rendered its exploration all the more alluring to Tarzan, since it suggested that in such a place might he hope to come upon the object of his long and difficult search. In the garden were tiny artificial streams and little pools of water, flanked by flowering bushes, as though it all had been designed by the cunning hand of some master gardener, so faithfully did it carry out the beauties and contours of nature upon a miniature scale. The interior surface of the wall was fashioned to represent the white cliffs of Palo Dawn, broken occasionally by small replicas of the verdure-filled gorges of the original. Filled with admiration and thoroughly enjoying each new surprise which the scene offered, Tarzan moved slowly around the garden, and as always he moved silently. Passing through a miniature forest, he came presently upon a tiny area of flower-studded sward, and at the same time beheld before him the first Hodon female he had seen since entering the palace. A young and beautiful woman stood in the center of the little open space, stroking the head of a bird which she held against her golden breastplate with one hand. Her profile was presented to the ape-man, and he saw that by the standards of any land she would have been accounted more than lovely. Seated in the grass at her feet, with her back toward him, was a female Wasdon slave. Seeing that he saw was not there, and apprehensive that an alarm be raised were he discovered by the two women, Tarzan moved back to hide himself in the foliage, but before he had succeeded, the Hodon girl turned quickly toward him as though apprised of his presence by that unnamed sense, the manifestations of which are more or less familiar to us all. At sight of him, her eyes registered only her surprise, though there was no expression of terror reflected in them, nor did she scream or even raise her well-modulated voice as she addressed him. "Who are you?" she asked, "who enters thus boldly the forbidden garden?" At sound of her mistress' voice, the slave maiden turned quickly, rising to her feet. "Tarzan Jad Guru," she exclaimed in tones of mingled astonishment and relief. "You know him," cried her mistress, turning toward the slave and affording Tarzan an opportunity to raise a cautioning finger to his lips lest Panat Lee further betray him, for it was Panat Lee indeed who stood before him, no less a source of surprise to him than had his presence been to her. Thus questioned by her mistress and simultaneously admonished to silence by Tarzan, Panat Lee was momentarily silenced, and then haltingly she groped for a way to extricate herself from her dilemma. "I thought," she faltered, "but no, I am mistaken. I thought that he was one whom I had seen before near the coral grave." The Hodon looked first at one and then at the other, an expression of doubt and questioning in her eyes. "But you have not answered me," she continued presently. "Who are you?" "You have not heard, then," asked Tarzan, "of the visitor who arrived at your king's court yesterday?" "You mean," she exclaimed, "that you are the Doral Otho?" And now the erstwhile doubting eyes reflected naught but awe. "I am," he replied. "Tarzan, and you?" "I am O-Lo-A, daughter of Kao-Tan, the king," she replied. So this was O-Lo-A, for love of whom Ta-Den had chosen exile rather than priesthood. Tarzan had approached more closely the dainty barbarian princess, daughter of Kao-Tan. He said, "Jad Ben Otho is pleased with you, and as a mark of his favor he has preserved for you through many dangers him whom you love." "I do not understand," replied the girl, but the flush that mounted to her cheek belied her words. "Bulat is a guest in the palace of Kao-Tan, my father. I do not know that he has faced any danger. It is to Bulat that I am betrothed." "But it is not Bulat whom you love," said Tarzan. Again the flush, and the girl half turned her face away. "Have I then displeased the great God?" she asked. "No," replied Tarzan. "As I told you, he is well satisfied, and for your sake he has saved Ta-Den for you." "Jad Ben Otho knows all," whispered the girl, "and his son shares his great knowledge." No, Tarzan hastened to correct her lest a reputation for omniscience might prove embarrassing. "I know only what Jad Ben Otho wishes me to know." "But tell me," she said, "I shall be reunited with Ta-Den. Surely the Son of God can read the future." The ape-man was glad that he had left himself an avenue of escape. "I know nothing of the future," he replied, "other than what Jad Ben Otho tells me. But I think you need have no fear for the future if you remain faithful to Ta-Den and Ta-Den's friends." "You have seen him?" asked O-Lo-A. "Tell me, where is he?" "Yes," replied Tarzan, "I have seen him. He was with Omat, the Gund of Kor-ul-Ja." "A prisoner of the Wasdon," interrupted the girl. "Not a prisoner, but an honored guest," replied the ape-man. "Wait," he exclaimed, raising his face toward the heavens. "Do not speak. I am receiving a message from Jad Ben Otho, my father." The two women dropped to their knees, covering their faces with their hands, stricken with awe at the thought of the awful nearness of the great god. Presently Tarzan touched O-Lo-A on the shoulder. "Rise," he said. Jad Ben Otho has spoken. He has told me that this slave girl is from the tribe of Kor-Uja, where Taden is, and that she is betrothed to Almat, their chief. Her name is Panat Lee. Olo turned questioningly toward Panat Lee. The latter nodded, her simple mind unable to determine whether or not she and her mistress were the victims of a colossal hoax. It is even as he says, she whispered. Oloa fell upon her knees and touched her forehead to Tarzan's feet. Great is the honor that Jad Ben Otho has done his poor servant, she cried. Carry to him my poor thanks for the happiness that he has brought to Oloa. It would please my father, said Tarzan, if you were to cause Panat Lee to be returned in safety to the village of her people. What cares Jad Ben Otho for such as she, asked Oloa, a slight trace of hauteur in her tone. There is but one God, replied Tarzan, and he is the God of the Wasdan as well as of the Hodan, of the birds and the beasts and the flowers and of everything that grows upon the earth or beneath the waters. If Panat Lee does right, she is greater in the eyes of Jad Ben Otho than would be the daughter of Keotan, should she do wrong. It was evident that Oloa did not quite understand this interpretation of divine favor, so contrary was it to the teachings of the priesthood of her people. In one respect only did Tarzan's teachings coincide with her belief that there was but one God. For the rest, she had always been taught that he was solely the God of the Hodan in every sense, other than that other creatures were created by Jad Ben Otho to serve some useful purpose for the benefit of the Hodan race. And now, to be told by the Son of God that she stood no higher in divine esteem than the black handmaiden at her side was indeed a shock to her pride, her vanity, and her faith. But who could question the word of Doro Otho, especially when she had with her own eyes seen him in actual communion with God in heaven? The will of Jad Ben Otho be done, said Oloa meekly, if it lies within my power, but it would be best, O Doro Otho, to communicate your father's wish directly to the king. Then keep her with you, said Tarzan, and see that no harm befalls her. Olo, I looked ruefully at Panat Lee. She was brought to me but yesterday, she said, and never have I had slave woman who pleased me better. I shall hate to part with her. But there are others, said Tarzan. Yes, replied Oloa, there are others, but there is only one Panat Lee. Many slaves are brought to the city, asked Tarzan. Yes, she replied. And many strangers come from other lands, he asked. She shook her head negatively. Only the Hodan from the other side of the valley of Jad Ben Otho, she replied, and they are not strangers. Am I then the first stranger to enter the gates of Allur, he asked. Can it be, she parried, that the son of Jad Ben Otho need question a poor ignorant mortal like Oloa? As I told you before, replied Tarzan, Jad Ben Otho alone is all-knowing. Then, if he wished you to know this thing, retorted Oloa quickly, you would know it. Inwardly the ape-man smiled that this little heathen's astuteness should beat him at his own game, yet in a measure her evasion of the question might be an answer to it. There have been other strangers here then recently. He persisted. I cannot tell you what I do not know, she replied. Always is the palace of Keotan filled with rumors, but how much fact and how much fancy how may a woman of the palace know? There has been such a rumor then, he asked. It was only rumor that reached the forbidden garden, she replied. It described, perhaps, a woman of another race. As he put the question and awaited her answer, he thought that his heart ceased to beat, so grave to him was the issue at stake. The girl hesitated before replying, and then, No, she said, I cannot speak of this thing, for if it be of sufficient importance to elicit the interest of the gods, then indeed would I be subject to the wrath of my father should I discuss it. In the name of Jad Ben Otho I command you to speak, said Tarzan. In the name of Jad Ben Otho, in whose hands lies the fate of Ta Den. The girl paled. Have mercy, she cried, and for the sake of Ta Den I will tell you all that I know. Tell what, demanded a stern voice from the shrubbery behind them. The three turned to see the figure of Keotan emerging from the foliage. An angry scowl distorted his kingly features, but at sight of Tarzan it gave place to an expression of surprise not unmixed with fear. Dorolotho, he exclaimed, I did not know that it was you, and then, raising his head and squaring his shoulders, he said, But there are places where even the son of the great god may not walk, and this, the forbidden garden of Keotan, is one. It was a challenge, but despite the king's bold front there was a note of apology in it, indicating that in his superstitious mind there flourished the inherent fear of man for his maker. Come, Dorolotho, He continued, I do not know all this foolish child has said to you, but whatever you would know, Tan, the king, will tell you. Oloe, go to your quarters immediately, and he pointed with stern finger toward the opposite end of the garden. The princess, followed by Pan at Lee, turned at once and left them. We will go this way, said Tan, and preceding led Tarzan in another direction. Close to that part of the wall which they approached, Tarzan perceived a grotto in the miniature cliff into the interior of which Tan led him, and down a rocky stairway to a gloomy corridor the opposite end of which opened into the palace proper. 2 armed warriors stood at this entrance to the forbidden garden, evidencing how jealously were the sacred precincts of the place guarded. In silence, Tan led the way back to his own quarters in the palace. A large chamber just outside the room toward which Tan was leading his guest was filled with chiefs and warriors awaiting the pleasure of their ruler. As the 2 entered, an aisle was formed for them the length of the chamber, down which they passed in silence. Close to the farther door and half hidden by the warriors who stood before him was Ludon, the high priest. Tarzan glimpsed him but briefly, but in that short period he was aware of a cunning and malevolent expression upon the cruel countenance that he was subconsciously aware boded him no good, and then with Tan he passed into the adjoining room and the hangings dropped. At the same moment, the hideous headdress of an under-priest appeared in the entrance of the outer chamber. Its owner, pausing for a moment, glanced quickly around the interior, and then, having located him whom he sought, moved rapidly in the direction of Ludon. There was a whispered conversation which was terminated by the high priest. Return immediately to the quarters of the princess, he said, and see that the slave is sent to me at the temple at once. The under-priest turned and departed upon his mission, while Ludon also left the apartment and directed his footsteps toward the sacred enclosure over which he ruled. A half-hour later, a warrior was ushered into the presence of Tan. Ludon, the high priest, desires the presence of Tan, the king, in the temple, he announced, and it is his wish that he come alone. Tan nodded to indicate that he accepted the command which even the king must obey. I will return presently, Doro Lotho, he said to Tarzan, and in the meantime my warriors and my slaves are yours to command. Chapter 11. The Sentence of Death. But it was an hour before the king re-entered the apartment, and in the meantime the ape-man had occupied himself in examining the carvings upon the walls and the numerous specimens of the handicraft of Paleo-Lildonian artisans, which combined to impart an atmosphere of richness and luxury to the apartment. The limestone of the country, close-grained and of marble whiteness, yet worked with comparative ease with crude implements, had been wrought by cunning craftsmen into bowls and urns and vases of considerable grace and beauty. Into the carved designs of many of these virgin gold had been hammered, presenting the effect of a rich and magnificent cloison. A barbarian himself, the art of barbarians had always appealed to the ape-man, to whom they represented a natural expression of man's love of the beautiful to even a greater extent than the studied and artificial efforts of civilization. Here was the real art of old masters, the other the cheap imitation of the chromo. It was while he was thus pleasurably engaged that Tan returned. As Tarzan, attracted by the movement of the hangings through which the king entered, turned and faced him, he was almost shocked by the remarkable alteration of the king's appearance. His face was livid, his hands trembled as with palsy, and his eyes were wide as with fright. His appearance was one apparently of a combination of consuming anger and withering fear. Tarzan looked at him questioningly. "You have had bad news, Tan?" he asked. The king mumbled an unintelligible reply. Behind there thronged into the apartment so great a number of warriors that they choked the entranceway. The king looked apprehensively to right and left. He cast terrified glances at the ape-man, and then raising his face and turning his eyes upward, he cried, "Jad Ben Otho, be my witness that I do not this thing of my own accord." There was a moment's silence, which was again broken by Tan. "Seize him," he cried to the warriors about him, "for Ludon, the high priest, swears that he is an impostor." To have offered armed resistance to this great concourse of warriors in the very heart of the palace of their king would have been worse than fatal. Already Tarzan had come far by his wits, and now that within a few hours he had had his hopes and his suspicions partially verified by the vague admissions of Oloa, he was impressed with the necessity of inviting no mortal risk that he could avoid. "Stop," he cried, raising his palm against them. "What is the meaning of this?" "Ludon claims he has proof that you are not the son of Jad Ben Otho," replied Tan. "He demands that you be brought to the throne room to face your accusers. If you are what you claim to be, none knows better than you that you need have no fear in acquiescing to his demands." But remember always that in such matters the high priest commands the king, and that I am only the bearer of these commands, not their author." Tarzan saw that Cayotan was not entirely convinced of his duplicity, as was evidenced by his palpable design to play safe. "Let not your warriors seize me," he said to Cayotan, "lest Jad Ben Otho, mistaking their intention, strike them dead." The effect of his words was immediate upon the men in the front rank of those who faced him, each seeming suddenly to acquire a new modesty that compelled him to self-effacement behind those directly in his rear, a modesty that became rapidly contagious. The ape-man smiled. "Fear not," he said, "I will go willingly to the audience chamber to face the blasphemers who accuse me." Arrived at the great throne room, a new complication arose. Cayotan would not acknowledge the right of Loudon to occupy the apex of the pyramid, and Loudon would not consent to occupying an inferior position, while Tarzan, to remain consistent with his high claims, insisted that no one should stand above him. But only to the ape-man was the humor of the situation apparent. To relieve the situation, Jadon suggested that all three of them occupy the throne, but this suggestion was repudiated by Cayotan, who argued that no mortal other than a king of Loudon had ever sat upon the high eminence, and that furthermore there was not room for three there. "But who," said Tarzan, "is my accuser and who is my judge?" "Loudon is your accuser," explained Cayotan. "And Loudon is your judge," cried the high priest. "I am to be judged by him who accuses me then," said Tarzan. "It were better to dispense then with any formalities and ask Loudon to sentence me." His tone was ironical, and his sneering face, looking straight into that of the high priest, but caused the latter's hatred to rise to still greater proportions. It was evident that Cayotan and his warriors saw the justice of Tarzan's implied objection to this unfair method of dispensing justice. "Only Cayotan can judge in the throne room of his palace," said Jadon. "Let him hear Loudon's charges and the testimony of his witnesses, and then let Cayotan's judgment be final." Cayotan, however, was not particularly enthusiastic over the prospect of sitting in trial upon one who might, after all, very possibly be the son of his god, and so he temporized, seeking for an avenue of escape. "It is purely a religious matter," he said, "and it is traditional that the kings of Loudon interfere, and not in questions of the church." "Then let the trial be held in the temple," cried one of the chiefs, for the warriors were as anxious as their king to be relieved of all responsibility in the matter. This suggestion was more than satisfactory to the high priest, who inwardly condemned himself for not having thought of it before. "It is true," he said, "this man's sin is against the temple. Let him be dragged thither then for trial." "The son of Jad Ben Otho will be dragged nowhere," cried Tarzan. "But when this trial is over, it is possible that the corpse of Loudon, the high priest, will be dragged from the temple of the god he would desecrate. Think well then, Loudon, before you commit this folly." His words, intended to frighten the high priest from his position, failed utterly in consummating their purpose. Loudon showed no terror at the suggestion the ape-man's words implied. Here is one, thought Tarzan, who, knowing more of his religion than any of his fellows, realizes fully the falsity of my claims as he does the falsity of the faith he preaches. He realized, however, that his only hope lay in seeming indifference to the charges. Cayotan and the warriors were still under the spell of their belief in him, and upon this fact must he depend in the final act of the drama that Loudon was staging for his rescue from the jealous priest whom he knew had already passed sentence upon him in his own heart. With a shrug he descended the steps of the pyramid. "It matters not to Doriul Otho," he said, "where Loudon enrages his god, for Jad Ben Otho can reach as easily into the chambers of the temple as into the throne room of Cayotan." Immeasurably relieved by this easy solution of their problem, the king and the warriors thronged from the throne room toward the temple grounds, their faith in Tarzan increased by his apparent indifference to the charges against him. Loudon led them to the largest of the altar courts. Taking his place behind the western altar, he motioned Cayotan to a place upon the platform at the left hand of the altar and directed Tarzan to a similar place at the right. As Tarzan ascended the platform, his eyes narrowed angrily at the sight which met them. The basin hollowed in the top of the altar was filled with water, in which floated the naked corpse of a new-born babe. "What means this?" he cried angrily, turning upon Loudon. The latter smiled malevolently. "That you do not know," he replied, "is but added evidence of the falsity of your claim. He who poses as the Son of God did not know that as the last rays of the setting sun flood the eastern altar of the temple, the lifeblood of an adult reddens the white stone for the edification of Jad Ben Otho, and that when the sun rises again from the body of its maker it looks first upon this western altar and rejoices in the death of a new-born babe each day, the ghost of which accompanies it across the heavens by day as the ghost of the adult returns with it to Jad Ben Otho at night. Even the little children of the Hodon know these things, while he who claims to be the son of Jad Ben Otho knows them not, and if this proof be not enough, there is more. Come, Wazdon, he cried, pointing to a tall slave who stood with a group of other blacks and priests on the temple floor at the left of the altar. The fellow came forward fearfully. Tell us what you know of this creature, cried Ludon, pointing to Tarzan. I have seen him before, said the Wazdon. I am of the tribe of Korul-Lul, and one day recently a party of which I was one encountered a few of the warriors of the Korul-Jah upon the ridge which separates our villages. Among the enemy was this strange creature whom they called Tarzan Jad Guru. And terrible indeed was he, for he fought with the strength of many men so that it required 20 of us to subdue him. But he did not fight as a god fights, and when a club struck him upon the head he sank unconscious as might an ordinary mortal. We carried him with us to our village as a prisoner, but he escaped after cutting off the head of the warrior we left to guard him and carrying it down into the gorge and tying it to the branch of a tree upon the opposite side. The word of a slave against that of a god, cried Jadon, who had shown previously a friendly interest in the pseudo-godling. It is only a step in the progress toward truth, interjected Ludon. Possibly the evidence of the only princess of the house of Khotan will have greater weight with the great chief from the north, though the father of a son who fled the holy offer of the priesthood may not receive with willing ears any testimony against another blasphemer. Jadon's hand leaped to his knife, but the warriors next him laid detaining fingers upon his arms. You are in the temple of Jad Ben Otho, Jadon, they cautioned, and the great chief was forced to swallow Ludon's affront, though it left in his heart bitter hatred of the high priest. And now Khotan turned toward Ludon. What knoweth my daughter of this matter, he asked. You would not bring a princess of my house to testify thus publicly. No, replied Ludon, not in person, but I have here one who will testify for her. He beckoned to an under-priest. Fetch the slave of the princess, he said. His grotesque headdress adding a touch of the hideous to the scene, the priest stepped forward, dragging the reluctant Pan-at-Lee by the wrist. The Princess Oloa was alone in the forbidden garden with but this one slave. Explained the priest. When there suddenly appeared from the foliage nearby this creature who claims to be the Doro Lotho. When the slave saw him, the princess says that she cried aloud in startled recognition and called the creature by name Tarzan Jad Guru, the same name that the slave from Korul-Lul gave him. Woman is not from Korul-Lul but from Korul-Jah, the very tribe with which the Korul-Lul says the creature was associating when he first saw him. And further, the princess said that when this woman, whose name is Pan-at-Lee, was brought to her yesterday, she told a strange story of having been rescued from a Toro Don in the Korul Gref by a creature such as this, whom she spoke of then as Tarzan Jad Guru, and of how the two were pursued in the bottom of the gorge by 2 monster griffs, and of how the man led them away while Pan-at-Lee escaped, only to be taken prisoner in the Korul-Lul as she was seeking to return to her own tribe. Is it not plain now, cried Ludon, that this creature is no god? Did he tell you that he was the son of God? He almost shouted, turning suddenly upon Pan-at-Lee. The girl shrank back terrified. Answer me, slave, cried the high priest. He seemed more than mortal, parried Pan-at-Lee. Did he tell you that he was the son of God? Answer my question, insisted Ludon. No, she admitted in a low voice, casting an appealing look of forgiveness at Tarzan, who returned a smile of encouragement and friendship. That is no proof that he is not the son of God, cried Jadon. Dost think Jad Ben Otho goes about crying, I am God? I am God, hast ever heard him, Ludon? No, you have not. Why should his son do that which the father does not do? Enough, cried Ludon. The evidence is clear. The creature is an impostor, and I, the head priest of Jad Ben Otho in the city of Allur, do condemn him to die. There was a moment's silence during which Ludon evidently paused for the dramatic effect of his climax. And if I am wrong, may Jad Ben Otho pierce my heart with his lightnings as I stand here before you all. The lapping of the wavelets of the lake against the foot of the palace wall was distinctly audible in the utter and almost breathless silence which ensued. Ludon stood with his face turned toward the heavens and his arms outstretched in the attitude of one who bares his breast to the dagger of an executioner. The warriors and the priests and the slaves gathered in the sacred court awaited the consuming vengeance of their god. It was Tarzan who broke the silence. "Your god ignores you, Loudon," he taunted, with a sneer that he meant to still further anger the high priest. "He ignores you, and I can prove it before the eyes of your priests and your people." "Prove it, blasphemer. How can you prove it?" "You have called me a blasphemer," replied Tarzan. "You have proved to your own satisfaction that I am an impostor, that I, an ordinary mortal, have posed as the son of God. Demand then that Jad Ben Otho uphold his godship and the dignity of his priesthood by directing his consuming fires through my own bosom." Again there ensued a brief silence while the onlookers waited for Loudon to thus consummate the destruction of this presumptuous impostor. "You dare not," taunted Tarzan, "for you know that I would be struck dead no quicker than were you." "You lie," cried Loudon, "and I would do it had I not but just received a message from Jad Ben Otho directing that your fate be different." A chorus of admiring and reverential ahs arose from the priesthood. Caotan and his warriors were in a state of mental confusion. Secretly they hated and feared Loudon, but so ingrained was their sense of reverence for the office of the high priest that none dared raise a voice against him. None. Well, there was Jadon, fearless old lion man of the north. The proposition was a fair one, he cried. "Invoke the lightnings of Jad Ben Otho upon this man if you would ever convince us of his guilt." "Enough of this," snapped Loudon. "Since when was Jadon created high priest? Seize the prisoner," he cried to the priests and warriors, "and on the morrow he shall die in the manner that Jad Ben Otho has willed." There was no immediate movement on the part of any of the warriors to obey the high priest's command, but the lesser priests, on the other hand, imbued with the courage of fanaticism, leapt eagerly forward like a flock of hideous harpies to seize upon their prey. The game was up. That Tarzan knew. No longer could cunning and diplomacy usurp the functions of the weapons of defense he best loved. And so the first hideous priest who leaped to the platform was confronted by no suave ambassador from heaven, but rather a grim and ferocious beast whose temper savored more of hell. The altar stood close to the western wall of the enclosure. There was just room between the two for the high priest to stand during the performance of the sacrificial ceremonies, and only Loudon stood there now behind Tarzan, while before him were perhaps 200 warriors and priests. The presumptuous one who would have had the glory of first laying arresting hands upon the blasphemous impersonator rushed forward with outstretched hand to seize the ape-man. Instead it was he who was seized by steel fingers that snapped him up as though he had been a dummy of straw, grasped him by one leg and the harness at his back, and raised him with giant arms high above the altar. Close at his heels were others ready to seize the ape-man and drag him down, and beyond the altar was Loudon with drawn knife advancing toward him. There was no instant to waste, nor was it the way of the ape-man to fritter away precious moments in the uncertainty of belated decision. Before Loudon or any other could guess what was in the mind of the condemned, Tarzan, with all the force of his great muscles, dashed the screaming hierophant in the face of the high priest, and as though the two actions were one, so quickly did he move. He had leaped to the top of the altar and from there to a handhold upon the summit of the temple wall. As he gained a footing there, he turned and looked down upon those beneath. For a moment he stood in silence, and then he spoke. "Who dare believe," he cried, "that Jad Ben Otho would forsake his son?" And then he dropped from their sight upon the other side. There were two at least left within the enclosure whose hearts leaped with involuntary elation at the success of the ape-man's maneuver, and one of them smiled openly. This was Jadon, and the other, Panat Lee. The brains of the priest that Tarzan had thrown at the head of Loudon had been dashed out against the temple wall, while the high priest himself had escaped with only a few bruises sustained in his fall to the hard pavement. Quickly scrambling to his feet, he looked around in fear and terror and finally in bewilderment, for he had not been a witness to the ape-man's escape. "Seize him," he cried, "seize the blasphemer." And he continued to look around in search of his victim with such a ridiculous expression of bewilderment that more than a single warrior was compelled to hide his smiles beneath his palm. The priests were rushing around wildly, exhorting the warriors to pursue the fugitive, but these awaited now stolidly the command of their king or high priest. Caotan, more or less secretly pleased by the discomfiture of Loudon, waited for that worthy to give the necessary directions, which he presently did when one of his acolytes excitedly explained to him the manner of Tarzan's escape. Instantly the necessary orders were issued, and priests and warriors sought the temple exit in pursuit of the ape-man. His departing words, hurled at them from the summit of the temple wall, had had little effect in impressing the majority that his claims had not been disproven by Loudon. But in the hearts of the warriors was admiration for a brave man, and in many the same unholy gratification that had risen in that of their ruler at the discomfiture of Loudon. A careful search of the temple grounds revealed no trace of the quarry. The secret recesses of the subterranean chambers, familiar only to the priesthood, were examined by these, while the warriors scattered through the palace and the palace grounds without the temple. Swift runners were dispatched to the city to arouse the people there, that all might be upon the lookout for Tarzan the Terrible. The story of his imposture and of his escape, and the tales that the Wasdon slaves had brought into the city concerning him, were soon spread throughout Allure, nor did they lose aught in the spreading. So that before an hour had passed, the women and children were hiding behind barred doorways, while the warriors crept apprehensively through the streets, expecting momentarily to be pounced upon by a ferocious demon who, bare-handed, did victorious battle with huge griffs, and whose lightest pastime consisted in tearing strong men limb from limb. Chapter 12. The Giant Stranger. And while the warriors and the priests of Allure searched the temple and the palace and the city for the vanished Ape-man there entered the head of Khor Olya down the precipitous trail from the mountains, a naked stranger bearing an Enfield upon his back. Silently he moved downward toward the bottom of the gorge, and there, where the ancient trail unfolded more levelly before him, he swung along with easy strides, though always with the utmost alertness against possible dangers. A gentle breeze came down from the mountains behind him, so that only his ears and his eyes were of value in detecting the presence of danger ahead. Generally the trail followed along the banks of the winding brooklet at the bottom of the gorge, but in some places where the waters tumbled over a precipitous ledge, the trail made a detour along the side of the gorge, and again it wound in and out among rocky outcroppings. And presently, where it rounded sharply the projecting shoulder of a cliff, the stranger came suddenly face to face with one who was ascending the gorge. Separated by 100 paces, the two halted simultaneously. Before him the stranger saw a tall white warrior, naked but for a loincloth, cross-belts and a girdle. The man was armed with a heavy, knotted club and a short knife, the latter hanging in its sheath at his left hip from the end of one of his cross-belts, the opposite belt supporting a leathern pouch at his right side. It was Tarzan hunting alone in the gorge of his friend, the chief of Khor Olya. He contemplated the stranger with surprise, but no wonder, since he recognized in him a member of the race with which his experience of Tarzan the Terrible had made him familiar, and also thanks to his friendship for the ape-man, he looked upon the newcomer without hostility. The latter was the first to make outward sign of his intentions, raising his palm toward Tarzan in that gesture which has been a symbol of peace from pole to pole since man ceased to walk upon his knuckles. Simultaneously he advanced a few paces and halted. Tarzan, assuming that one so like Tarzan the Terrible must be a fellow tribesman of his lost friend, was more than glad to accept this overture of peace, the sign of which he returned in kind as he ascended the trail to where the other stood. "Who are you?" he asked, but the newcomer only shook his head to indicate that he did not understand. By signs he tried to carry to the Hodon the fact that he was following a trail that had led him over a period of many days from some place beyond the mountains, and Tarzan was convinced that the newcomer sought Tarzan Jadguru. He wished, however, that he might discover whether as friend or foe. The stranger perceived the Hodon's prehensile thumbs and great toes and his long tail with an astonishment which he sought to conceal, but greater than all was the sense of relief that the first inhabitant of this strange country whom he had met had proven friendly. So greatly would he have been handicapped by the necessity for forcing his way through a hostile land. Tarzan, who had been hunting for some of the smaller mammals, the meat of which is especially relished by the Hodon, forgot his intended sport in the greater interest of his new discovery. He would take the stranger to Omat, and possibly together the two would find some way of discovering the true intentions of the newcomer. And so again, through signs, he apprised the other that he would accompany him, and together they descended toward the cliffs of Omat's people. As they approached these, they came upon the women and children working under guard of the old men, and the youths gathering the wild fruits and herbs which constitute a part of their diet, as well as tending the small acres of growing crops which they cultivate. The fields lay in small level patches that had been cleared of trees and brush. Their farm implements consisted of metal shod poles which bore a closer resemblance to spears than to tools of peaceful agriculture. Supplementing these were others with flattened blades that were neither hoes nor spades, but instead possessed the appearance of an unhappy attempt to combine the two implements in one. At first sight of these people, the stranger halted and unslung his bow, for these creatures were black as night, their bodies entirely covered with hair. But Tarzan, interpreting the doubt in the other's mind, reassured him with a gesture and a smile. The Wasdon, however, gathered around excitedly jabbering questions in a language which the stranger discovered his guide understood, though it was entirely unintelligible to the former. They made no attempt to molest him, and he was now sure that he had fallen among a peaceful and friendly people. It was but a short distance now to the caves, and when they reached these, Tarzan led the way aloft upon the wooden pegs, assured that this creature whom he had discovered would have no more difficulty in following him than had Tarzan the Terrible. Nor was he mistaken, for the other mounted with ease, until presently the two stood within the recess before the cave of Omat the chief. The latter was not there, and it was mid-afternoon before he returned, but in the meantime many warriors came to look upon the visitor, and in each instance the latter was more thoroughly impressed with the friendly and peaceable spirit of his hosts, little guessing that he was being entertained by a ferocious and warlike tribe who never before the coming of Tarzan and Tarzan had suffered a stranger among them. At last Omat returned, and the guest sensed intuitively that he was in the presence of a great man among these people, possibly a chief or king. For not only did the attitude of the other black warriors indicate this, but it was written also in the mien and bearing of the splendid creature who stood looking at him while Tarzan explained the circumstances of their meeting. And I believe, Omat concluded the Hodon, that he seeks Tarzan the Terrible. At the sound of that name, the first intelligible word that had fallen upon the ears of the stranger since he had come among them, his face lightened. Tarzan, he cried, Tarzan of the apes, and by signs he tried to tell them that it was he whom he sought. They understood, and also they guessed from the expression of his face that he sought Tarzan from motives of affection rather than the reverse, but of this Omat wished to make sure. He pointed to the stranger's knife, and repeating Tarzan's name, seized Tarzan and pretended to stab him, immediately turning questioningly toward the stranger. The latter shook his head vehemently, and then first placing a hand above his heart, he raised his palm in the symbol of peace. "He is a friend of Tarzan Jadguru," exclaimed Tarzan. "Either a friend or a great lie," replied Omat. "Tarzan," continued the stranger, "you know him? He lives? Oh God, if I could only speak your language," and again reverting to sign language, he sought to ascertain where Tarzan was. He would pronounce the name and point in different directions, in the cave, down into the gorge, back toward the mountains, or out upon the valley below, and each time he would raise his brows questioningly and voice the universal A of interrogation which they could not fail to understand. But always Omat shook his head and spread his palms in a gesture which indicated that, while he understood the question, he was ignorant as to the whereabouts of the ape-man, and then the black chief attempted as best he might to explain to the stranger what he knew of the whereabouts of Tarzan. He called the newcomer Jardon, which in the language of Palil Don means stranger, and he pointed to the sun and said as. This he repeated several times, and then he held up one hand with the fingers outspread and touching them one by one, including the thumb, repeated the word Adnan until the stranger understood that he meant 5. Again he pointed to the sun, and describing an arc with his forefinger starting at the eastern horizon and terminating at the western, he repeated again the words as Adnan. It was plain to the stranger that the words meant that the sun had crossed the heavens 5 times. In other words, 5 days had passed. Omat then pointed to the cave where they stood, pronouncing Tarzan's name and imitating a walking man with the first and second fingers of his right hand upon the floor of the recess, sought to show that Tarzan had walked out of the cave and climbed upward on the pegs 5 days before. But this was as far as the sign language would permit him to go. This far the stranger followed him, and indicating that he understood, he pointed to himself, and then indicating the pegs leading above, announced that he would follow Tarzan. "Let us go with him," said Omat, "for as yet we have not punished the Korol for killing our friend and ally." "Persuade him to wait until morning," said Tarzan, "that you may take with you many warriors and make a great raid upon the Korol, and this time, Omat, do not kill your prisoners. Take as many as you can alive, and from some of them we may learn the fate of Tarzan Jadguru." "Great is the wisdom of the Hodon," replied Omat. "It shall be as you say, and having made prisoners of all the Korol, we shall make them tell us what we wish to know, and then we shall march them to the rim of Korol Greif and push them over the edge of the cliff." Tarzan smiled. He knew that they would not take prisoner all the Korol warriors, that they would be fortunate if they took one, and it was also possible that they might even be driven back in defeat. But he knew too that Omat would not hesitate to carry out his threat if he had the opportunity. So implacable was the hatred of these neighbors for each other. It was not difficult to explain Omat's plan to the stranger or to win his consent, since he was aware, when the Great Black had made it plain that they would be accompanied by many warriors. That their venture would probably lead them into a hostile country, and every safeguard that he could employ he was glad to avail himself of, since the furtherance of his quest was the paramount issue. He slept that night upon a pile of furs in one of the compartments of Omat's ancestral cave, and early the next day following the morning meal they sallied forth, 100 savage warriors swarming up the face of the sheer cliff and out upon the summit of the ridge. The main body preceded by 2 warriors whose duties coincided with those of the point of modern military maneuvers, safeguarding the column against the danger of too sudden contact with the enemy. Across the ridge they went and down into the Coral Lul, and there almost immediately they came upon a lone and unarmed Wasdon, who was making his way fearfully up the gorge toward the village of his tribe. Him they took prisoner, which, strangely, only added to his terror, since from the moment that he had seen them and realized that escape was impossible, he had expected to be slain immediately. "Take him back to Coral Jah," said Omat to one of his warriors, "and hold him there unharmed until I return." And so the puzzled Coral Lul was led away while the savage company moved stealthily from tree to tree in its closer advance upon the village. Fortune smiled upon Omat, in that it gave him quickly what he sought, a battle royal, for they had not yet come in sight of the caves of the Coral Lul when they encountered a considerable band of warriors headed down the gorge upon some expedition. Like shadows, the Coral Jah melted into the concealment of the foliage upon either side of the trail. Ignorant of impending danger, safe in the knowledge that they trod their own domain where each rock and stone was as familiar as the features of their mates, the Coral Lul walked innocently into the ambush. Suddenly the quiet of that seeming peace was shattered by a savage cry, and a hurled club felled the Coral Lul. The cry was a signal for a savage chorus from 100 Coral Jah throats, with which were soon mingled the war cries of their enemies. The air was filled with flying clubs, and then as the 2 forces mingled, the battle resolved itself into a number of individual encounters as each warrior singled out a foe and closed upon him. Knives gleamed and flashed in the mottling sunlight that filtered through the foliage of the trees above. Sleek black coats were streaked with crimson stains. In the thick of the fight, the smooth brown skin of the stranger mingled with the black bodies of friend and foe. Only his keen eyes and his quick wit had shown him how to differentiate between Coral Lul and Coral Jah, since with the single exception of apparel they were identical. But at the first rush of the enemy he had noticed that their loincloths were not of the leopard-matted hides such as were worn by his allies. Omat, after dispatching his first antagonist, glanced at Jardon. "He fights with the ferocity of Jato," mused the chief. "Powerful indeed must be the tribe from which he and Tarzan Jadguru come," and then his whole attention was occupied by a new assailant. The fighters surged to and fro through the forest until those who survived were spent with exhaustion, all but the stranger, who seemed not to know the sense of fatigue. He fought on when each new antagonist would have gladly quit, and when there were no more Coral Lul who were not engaged, he leaped upon those who stood pantingly facing the exhausted Coral Jah. And always he carried upon his back the peculiar thing which Omat had thought was some manner of strange weapon, but the purpose of which he could not now account for in view of the fact that Jardon never used it, and that for the most part it seemed but a nuisance and needless encumbrance, since it banged and smashed against its owner as he leapt, cat-like, hither and thither in the course of his victorious duels. The bow and arrows he had tossed aside at the beginning of the fight, but the Enfield he would not discard, for where he went, he meant that it should go until its mission had been fulfilled. Presently the Coral Jah, seemingly shamed by the example of Jardon, closed once more with the enemy, but the latter, moved no doubt to terror by the presence of the stranger, a tireless demon who appeared invulnerable to their attacks, lost heart and sought to flee. And then it was that, at Omat's command, his warriors surrounded a half-dozen of the most exhausted and made them prisoners. It was a tired, bloody, and elated company that returned victorious to the Coral Jah. 20 of their number were carried back, and 6 of these were dead men. It was the most glorious and successful raid that the Coral Jah had made upon the Coral Lul in the memory of man, and it marked Omat as the greatest of chiefs, but that fierce warrior knew that advantage had lain upon his side largely because of the presence of his strange ally. Nor did he hesitate to give credit where credit belonged, with the result that Jardon and his exploits were upon the tongue of every member of the tribe of Coral Jah, and great was the fame of the race that could produce 2 such as he and Tarzan Jadguru. And in the gorge of Coral Lul beyond the ridge, the survivors spoke in bated breath of this second demon that had joined forces with their ancient enemy. Return to his cave. Omet caused the Korolul prisoners to be brought into his presence singly, and each he questioned as to the fate of Tarzan. Without exception, they told him the same story, that Tarzan had been taken prisoner by them 5 days before, but that he had slain the warrior left to guard him and escaped, carrying the head of the unfortunate sentry to the opposite side of Korolul, where he had left it suspended by its hair from the branch of a tree. But what had become of him after, they did not know, not one of them, until the last prisoner was examined, he whom they had taken first, the unarmed Korolul, making his way from the direction of the valley of Jad Ben Otho toward the caves of his people. This one, when he discovered the purpose of their questioning, bartered with them for the lives and liberty of himself and his fellows. I can tell you much of this terrible man of whom you ask, Korol-Jah, he said. I saw him yesterday, and I know where he is, and if you will promise to let me and my fellows return in safety to the caves of our ancestors, I will tell you all, and truthfully, that which I know. You will tell us anyway, replied Omet, or we shall kill you. You will kill me anyway, retorted the prisoner, unless you make me this promise. So if I am to be killed, the thing I know shall go with me. He is right, Omet said. Then promise him that they shall have their liberty. Very well, said Omet. Speak, Korolul, and when you have told me all, you and your fellows may return unharmed to your tribe. It was thus commenced the prisoner. 3 days since I was hunting with a party of my fellows near the mouth of Korolul, not far from where you captured me this morning, when we were surprised and set upon by a large number of Hodon, who took us prisoners and carried us to a lure where a few were chosen to be slaves and the rest were cast into a chamber beneath the temple, where are held for sacrifice the victims that are offered by the Hodon to Jad Ben Otho upon the sacrificial altars of the temple at a lure. It seemed then that indeed was my fate sealed, and that lucky were those who had been selected for slaves among the Hodon, for they at least might hope to escape. Those in the chamber with me must be without hope. But yesterday a strange thing happened. There came to the temple, accompanied by all the priests and by the king and many of his warriors, one whom all did great reverence, and when he came to the barred gateway leading to the chamber in which we wretched ones awaited our fate, I saw to my surprise that it was none other than that terrible man who had so recently been a prisoner in the village of Korolul, he whom you called Tarzan Jadguru, but whom they addressed as Dorololotho. And he looked upon us and questioned the high priest, and when he was told of the purpose for which we were imprisoned there, he grew angry and cried that it was not the will of Jad Ben Otho that his people be thus sacrificed, and he commanded the high priest to liberate us, and this was done. The Hodon prisoners were permitted to return to their homes, and we were led beyond the city of Allur and set upon our way toward Korolul. There were 3 of us. But many are the dangers that lie between Allur and Korolul, and we were only 3 and unarmed. Therefore none of us reached the village of our people, and only one of us lives. I have spoken. That is all you know concerning Tarzan Jadguru, asked Omet. That is all I know, replied the prisoner, other than that he whom they call Ludon, the high priest at Allur, was very angry, and that one of the 2 priests who guided us out of the city said to the other that the stranger was not Dorolotho at all. That Ludon had said so, and that he had also said that he would expose him and that he should be punished with death for his presumption. That is all they said within my hearing. And now, chief of Korol-Jah, let us depart. Omet nodded. Go your way, he said, and be on. Send warriors to guard them until they are safely within the Korol-Lul. Jardon, he said, beckoning to the stranger, come with me, and rising he led the way toward the summit of the cliff, and when they stood upon the ridge it pointed down into the valley toward the city of Allur, gleaming in the light of the western sun. There is Tarzan Jadguru, he said, and Jardon understood.